Good day. The last few hours have witnessed what might be called dramatic developments in Donbass, in the battle in Donbass, which perhaps give further reason to think that we are starting to see a progressive collapse, an accelerating collapse of Ukrainian forces there. The key event was the capture by the Russians and their allied forces of the town of Liman, which, by the way, now that is once again come under the control of the authorities of the Donetsk People's Republic, one of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, which Russia has now recognized as independent. The authorities of that republic, which now administer or will administer Liman, they now once again calling it Krasny Liman, Red Liman, a name which it was given in the 1920s during the period of Soviet rule and which reflected the very strong pro-Bolshevik sentiments of its population at that time. Of course, we're talking about the 1920s. Anyway, Liman fell to the Russians, and it fell fast. It fell within a few hours in a battle which, judging from some of the comments that I'd been reading before its fall from various pro-Russian sites, the Russians had expected would fall after perhaps a week or perhaps a couple of days of heavy fighting. Moreover, there are reports of a mass surrender of Ukrainian troops who were supposed to be defending Liman. Now, the exact number of these troops that were defending Liman is not clear, but prior to the battle for Liman, I gathered that there were about one or 1,500 Ukrainian troops there. It seems that at least 500 of those troops decided that they wouldn't fight and gave up almost immediately and are now captives under Russian control. And by the way, the authorities of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic claim they now hold around 8,000 Ukrainian prisoners. Around half of these, of course, will be the forces that surrendered in Mariupol after the surrender at the Azovstal factory. But clearly the numbers of captives, Ukrainian captives, is swelling. And I've also seen a video whose authenticity, I should say, once again, I can't confirm, but it appears to show an armored vehicle, a Ukrainian armored vehicle, with Ukrainian troops clinging to it, trying to flee from Liman as Ukrainian opposition resistance in the town collapsed. Now, this has come shortly after the collapse of Ukrainian resistance in another Ukrainian town, Svetodarsk, and of course it also comes shortly after the surrender, the mass surrender at the Azovstal steelworks. Now, the surrender at the Azovstal steelworks, the surrender in Mariupol, I think must be separated, distinguished from the events that we see in places like Liman, Svetodarsk. All of these places are in the northern Donbass in terms of distance, quite far away, in fact, from Mariupol. So one perhaps shouldn't connect these two events. But the fall of Liman, the fall of Svetodarsk, they do seem to be connected with each other, and they strongly suggest that following the capture by the Russians of Popasnaya about 3 weeks ago, the Ukrainian forces in this part of Donbass are now in a ever-accelerating process of collapse. And over the course of the day, since we've heard more reports that Liman has been captured by the Russians, Liman was a place, by the way, with a population before the war of around 20,000. So we're not talking about a village, we're talking about a small town. But anyway, since the fall of Liman to the Russians, I've been getting more reports of more villages and settlements across this area of northern Donbass falling under Russian control, that the Russian troops are now closing in on the important transport hub, still under Ukrainian control, of Bakhmut, sometimes referred to as Artemyevsk. I presume these are different names that different parties to the war give to the same place. It's clear that the Ukrainians and the Russians often give slightly different names, or sometimes entirely different names, to the same towns or settlements. And in addition, just before I started this program, I saw a report, this time from the officials of the Lugansk People's Republic. This is another of the two Donbass republics, the other of the two Donbass republics, the breakaway republics of the Donbass, whose independence Russia has recognized. Anyway, there was a report there from these authorities that all the remaining roads into Severodonetsk and Lysychansk have now been cut, and that the Ukrainian force in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk has now been completely isolated. And this has come together with further reports from Ukrainian officials pointing to a severely deteriorating picture in Donbass. Perhaps the most dramatic one is from the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Kuleba, a person who is normally seen as very much a hardliner, somebody who seems to want to pursue a policy of no compromise with Russia. He's now made a statement saying that the situation in Donbass is even worse than people are saying it is. I'm not sure which people he's referring to, but I presume he means people in Ukraine and presumably also people in the West. And as I was saying a few days ago, there's also now been a dramatic shift in Western discussions and coverage of the war. Perhaps the most dramatic example up to now has come from the Washington Post, where we've now had a long article by Sudarshan Raghavan, who describes a situation of gathering crisis, of Ukrainian leaders projecting an image of military invulnerability against Russia, but of local commanders offering a more realistic portrait of the war. This is, I'm quoting now, where outgunned volunteers describe being abandoned by their military brass and facing certain death at the front. And he speaks increasingly of a catastrophic situation of an entire platoon which has essentially given up fighting, with people complaining of lack of weaponry, ammunition, food and proper command support. And he quotes one volunteer saying, "We are being sent to certain death. We are not alone in this. We are many." And of course, this has been criticized by the Ukrainian authorities. But elsewhere in the report, we read, we shot another Ukrainian volunteer, somebody from the town of Lviv in western Ukraine, complaining that he signed up as a volunteer, believing that he'd be put in security positions, to look after security posts in and around Lviv itself, which is of course far from the front lines, and complaining that he was thrown into the battle. And he says that we shot 30 bullets, and then they said, "You can't get more, too expensive." When we're coming here, we were told that we were going to be in the third line of defense. Instead, we came to the zero line, the front line. We didn't know where we were going. And we read further. In recent weeks, the situation has gotten much worse. When their supply chains were cut off for 2 days by the bombardment, the men were forced to make do with a potato a day. They spent most days and nights in trenches, dug into the forest, on the edges of Tushivka or inside the basements of abandoned houses. They have no water, nothing there, only water that I bring them every other day. So, and then we also get comments like about Ukrainian troops. Many got shell shock. I don't know how to count them. The casualties here are largely kept secret to protect morale among troops and the general public. On the Ukrainian TV, we see that there are no losses, and clearly that isn't the case. So this is all taken from the Washington Post, from an article placed in the article in the Washington Post, and it summarizes by saying Lapko and his men have grown increasingly frustrated and disillusioned with their superiors. His request for the awards has not been approved. His battalion commander demanded that he send 20 of his soldiers to another front line, which meant that he couldn't rotate his men out of Tushivka. And we hear that a force that started at numbering around 150 has now fallen to 54. So this is the kind of report that we're now starting to get from the battlefield of an increasingly catastrophic situation, and it's even appearing in the Western media. I read a similar article, not quite as strong as the Washington Post one, but I read a similar article in The Guardian, and you're starting to see more of others like that appearing in all sorts of places. And one gets the sense of a military that's now running out of pretty much everything, of armaments, of food, of supplies, and indeed of men. Now, this calls further into context that famous $40 billion there's $40 billion of weapons that the United States is supposedly or allegedly going to supply to Ukraine. And, we're getting very contradictory information about this. Some say that the United States is not going to supply, for example, advanced multiple rocket launchers to Ukraine. Others say that they will. I suspect eventually that they will. But anyway, Larry Johnson has done another analysis of the figures, and these analyses are now being made by all sorts of people, and they all seem to me to corroborate my own understanding of this $40 billion aid package. Only $6 billion out of that $40 billion is actually destined to help directly the Ukrainian war effort. Some of that, an undisclosed part of it, of that $6 billion is for weapons. Some of it is for training. So we don't know what actual amount of weapons out of that $6 billion will be provided. But perhaps a more interesting point is that apparently $9 to $10 billion is intended to replenish US arsenals for weapon systems already sent to Ukraine. Now, $9 to $10 billion to replenish US arsenals, US military arsenals for weapon systems already sent to Ukraine means, if my maths is right, is more than the less than $6 billion of armaments which is now authorized for Ukraine under this package. So, in reality, since this $9 to $10 billion is to replace the $9 to $10 billion of weapons already sent to Ukraine, this $40 billion package, which is actually less than $6 billion in actual weapons, that suggests that the real amount of weapons, the real American investment in terms of weapons for Ukraine is actually diminishing. It was 9 to 10 billion before, which now has to be replaced. It's only going to be less than 6 billion this time. One should always read these big jumbo spending packages that the United States comes up with great deal of detail. Often the headline figures are very misleading. And in this case, instead of it suggesting or implying an escalation of American support for Ukraine, it suggests, on the contrary, a possible, I say possible, reduction of American support for Ukraine. That, of course, still leaves the question of this Lend-Lease program. Lend-Lease is the idea of Lend-Lease in the Second World War is that Ukraine, Britain in the Second World War, but Ukraine this time, comes along, contacts American weapons producers, orders weapons from them. And they then make these weapons and then they supply them. Well, it was to Britain and the Soviet Union during the Second World War. It will be to Ukraine this time. And of course, in the meantime, until Ukraine is able to pay for these weapons, it's the United States, as happened with Lend-Lease, which will be footing the bill until, of course, the United States gets repaid by Ukraine, which will probably be never, incidentally. But let's unpack what that means, because, of course, if Ukraine comes along to, say, Raytheon and orders, well, perhaps more Javelin missiles. I gather the Javelin has not been a great success, but let's assume that Ukraine orders more weapon systems from Raytheon for the war and places an order for these weapon systems, and Raytheon agrees to make them and then supply them to Ukraine. Well, that already suggests an extended timetable. Raytheon needs to build these weapons. It needs to make these weapons first so that they can be supplied to Ukraine. Now, I don't know how long that takes. It could be weeks, it could be months. If we're talking about heavy weapons, if we're talking about tanks, then that will certainly be months. Perhaps if we're talking about even more advanced weapons, Patriot missiles, F-35 fighters, that will take years. I don't think Ukraine, based on what we're seeing at the moment, has those years. I'm going to say something else. I think that the fact that in reality, West American arms supplies, on the basis of the $40 billion package to Ukraine, American arms supplies might actually be falling, tells us something else, which is that US arsenals are becoming depleted faster, have been depleting faster than Ukraine's losses. Rather, that as Ukraine loses more and more equipment, the US its arsenals, its own arsenals, are becoming depleted at such a rate that the United States military has itself essentially told the administration, it's told the White House, it's told the Pentagon leadership that it cannot risk sending more weapons to Ukraine out of its own arsenals, because were that to happen, then in that case, the United States itself would find itself, the US military would itself find itself dangerously short of weapons. In other words, US reserve stocks are becoming depleted to critical levels. And that, by the way, doubtless explains not just the reduction from the $9 to $10 billion supplied before to the less than $6 billion that are being supplied now, but it also doubtless explains this otherwise rather strange decision to go for a Lend-Lease package. Lend-Lease has been brought back in order to re-equip Ukraine with newly produced weapons because the United States has run out, or is running out, or is in danger of running out of weapons that it can supply from its own stocks. Now, that suggests that all these hopes that the Ukrainians have had, or fears that the Ukrainians have that others have had, that Ukraine will be able to rebuild its forces with this vast flood of Western weapons, that is utterly wrong, and that far from Western weapon supplies to Ukraine increasing, they are actually starting to dwindle and run out. And the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, has actually all but said as much. He's actually said that in the event of a war with Russia, would have to be with Russia, of the same intensity as the one in Ukraine, the EU, NATO forces, would run out of all their ammunition within about 2 weeks. So that tells us something about the actual state of Western militaries, but it also tells us something about the direction of the war. Far from Ukraine being able to sustain a war for much longer, far from Ukraine being able to go on the offensive or the counteroffensive, it is running out of men and supplies and ammunition and weapons, and the West is now struggling to supply those weapons, to replace the weapons that have been lost and before long may no longer be able to do so. That flood of Western weapons that poured into Ukraine at the start of the war may have bought Ukraine a few weeks, but those weeks are running out, and Ukraine is now facing a military crisis which it seems to have no real answer to. I'm going to say something else, by the way. I've heard a report. I want to say I heard this report. It was actually passed to me on a live stream. But I've heard a report that Russia is able to build 32 to 50 caliber missiles a day. In other words, the Russian military defense system, the Russian military industrial complex, far from running out of weapons, is at the stage where it is able to crank ever more of them out. I can't corroborate that report. I'm told it's in the Russian media. Not everything the Russian media says is reliable. For what it's worth, I believe it to be true. So there we are. What in this situation does Ukraine do? Well, President Zelensky once again now today is talking about the need to negotiate peace, but he doesn't seem to be able to come up with any constructive and realistic ideas. I don't think that the Russians would be prepared to sit down with President Zelensky. I think they have lost all confidence and patience with him. I don't think anyway that the Russians are going to do anything that is going to impede or slow down their ongoing offensive in Donbass. I think that they will continue that offensive at the very least until all of Donbass is cleared. I suspect that the Russians will anyway want to press on to Zaporozhye, as I discussed. Now, I should say that in terms of the Battle of Donbass, the fall of Liman and certain advances that this big Russian force that has been gathering around ETHEREUM has started to make now mean that the Russians are within shelling distance of the important town of Slavyansk, the northern part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, which is the other place apart from Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, where the Ukrainians have concentrated large numbers of troops. And most people, myself included, think that once the Ukrainian forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are defeated, in terms of the Donbass, it's basically game over. But assuming that's right, and assuming that the next important town city after Donbass that the Russians target is going to be Zaporozhye, and the Russians are now extending their telephone system into Zaporozhye region. They're starting to pay people in rubles in Zaporozhye. They're clearly giving indications that they see Zaporozhye region as another part of Ukraine that they want to bring under their control, which clearly indicates, to my way of thinking, that Zaporozhye city is a pending target. Once Zaporozhye falls, assuming it does, but once it does, the very important Ukrainian city of Dnipro, which the Russians still call Dnipropetrovsk, starts to look extremely vulnerable. Zaporozhye, by my reading of the maps, is further from Russian front lines, though still quite close to Russian front lines, than Dnipro is from Zaporozhye. So the Russians would be edging very close to Dnipro. Now, Dnipro is a much bigger place than any of these places that we've been talking about up to now. It has a population of around 900,000. It's just under 1 million people. Now, it is a big place, but remember, Mariupol had a population of around 400 to 500,000 people, and as has been pointed out by several commentators, if you disregard the saga of the Azovstal factory, then Dnipro may be bigger, but assuming that the Russians are able to throw more forces at it than they were able to throw at Mariupol, which is plausible, it only took the Russians about a month, 6 weeks, to capture most of the residential areas of Mariupol. If the Russians throw similar sized or larger forces to Dnipro, well, perhaps they could have that city under their control within a couple of weeks. The Russians do seem to have worked out how to fight in urban settings. They seem to be able to do it very effectively. A person with a military background told me that in reality, in Mariupol, given the speed with which the residential areas of Mariupol were captured, the Russians went through Mariupol, as he put it, like a knife through butter. So perhaps Dnipro is not so far out of their reach. As I said, it's twice the size of Mariupol, but judging from what happened in Mariupol, it might not be beyond their ability to capture and to capture reasonably fast. Now, I would say that like Mariupol, Dnipro has important factories. There's the giant Yuzhnoye rocket factory there. I would guess that a factory like that, which is an important part of the Soviet military-industrial complex, like the Motorsich factory, is likely to have similar bunkers to the kind of bunkers that we saw at Azovstal. So it's possible that there might be some brave spirits from the Ukrainian defenders who, once the residential parts of the city are captured, will withdraw to these factory areas and will try to hold out there. But in Azovstal, that only lasted for a limited space of time, and I would guess that in both Zaporozhye, if Ukrainian defenders pulled back and hid in bunkers under the Motorsich factory, and in Dnipropetrovsk, if they did the same, in the industrial region of Dnipropetrovsk or Dnipro, I suspect that, again, they would only buy themselves a few weeks of time. And I wonder whether the Ukrainian troops who would be defending these two cities, Zaporozhye and Dnipro, would be as dedicated and as committed as the Ukrainian troops, especially those from the Azov regiment, who were trying to defend the Azovstal steelworks are. So it looks as if we're seeing a cascade of events, Ukraine running out of supplies, weapon systems, and perhaps soldiers, losing disastrously in the battles of the Donbass, and it looking also as if Western supplies of weapons, far from intensifying, far from increasing, as some people are perhaps expecting, the likelihood is that after a small bump up with artillery pieces and those sort of things, that we'll see a brief rise, and then, perhaps including multiple rocket launches. As I said, I think there will be some supplied, probably never in enough numbers to make a significant difference. So we see a rise and then a quick fall. Now, a bleak picture. Now, before I round off this discussion of the actual situation, I am going to return briefly to the situation at Azovstal, because I heard a report yesterday that apparently there are still around 50 Ukrainian soldiers, mainly from the Azov regiment, still hiding in these bunkers beneath the Azovstal factory, unwilling to give up, unwilling to join the others in surrendering. Around 1,700 surrendered, but around 50 really committed soldiers are still desperately trying to hide and cling on, and that the Russians have sent special forces to try and clear them out of the factory. So, we will probably see stragglers, dedicated people cut off from what's going on, unable to face the reality of surrender, clinging on like Japanese soldiers in Pacific Islands long after the war has ended. But the fact is, it's not going to prevent the end of the war. So what happens? Where does this go? Well, we've seen all these discussions now in the West about the need that some people are making for a negotiated settlement. We see Henry Kissinger talking about the need for negotiations, that there's only a 2-month time window, according to Kissinger, before the situation becomes irretrievable. It's essentially what he was saying. And we see others coming forward with the same proposals. I have to say that I think that we do not have 2 months. I think we have perhaps 2 weeks at most. And I say 2 weeks if Ukraine is to be preserved. We've now had an article, an editorial from the New York Times calling for talks. We've now had the Washington Post describing the dire situation of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian army in Donbass. We've had the Italians coming forward with these initiatives, their various peace initiatives, which have been much ridiculed and mocked by the Russians. And we've seen Henry Kissinger say he's peace. Well, it's neither now or never. Unless this happens, as I said, within the next 10 days to 2 weeks, I think we will be past the point of no return. I think at that point, it will no longer make much sense for the Russians to negotiate at all. I think they will say to themselves that after all that has happened, they no longer need to negotiate, and they might as well continue their operation until the point comes when they can dictate terms. We'll see whether I'm right. Well, I am running out of breath, but anyway, I've said all I was going to say. I'm going to stop now. Join us on Locals and Rumble. Go to our shop. Tick the like button if you've liked this video. Check your subscription to this channel, and more from me soon. And can I also say that over the weekend, I'm planning to do a video on locals, probably exclusive to locals, in which I will also cover that other Washington Post article about how Russia supposedly is retreating into a command economy, and it's all back to the USSR and the shortages with planes falling from the sky and cranky old Moskvich cars going around Moscow. I want to say that I think that's all a ridiculous article, but it's one that I do want to address and I do want to write about. And please look out for that on Locals. As I said, it will be coming out fairly soon, perhaps tomorrow or on Sunday, over the weekend. Join us on Locals and you'll see it there. In the meantime, thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day. Until then.